This is the Almost Daily ZenCast. Hello, and Namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
As always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for giving me space in the mindscape of your life. I hope that I'm a welcome guest and not a rude intruder into your mental environment. This morning, while wondering what I would talk about in today's live broadcast, I dug up a note. I can't quite remember when I wrote it. And time not actually existing, the date and such becomes immaterial. But I was reminded that I wanted to explore this very explicitly in various ways in my playwriting. And so I'm glad I found it today, because I want to then, when I shift my focus later on, make sure that I keep this in my mind for when I tackle a project later this week, which is going to be revising the first script I've ever finished. I have several that have been sort of in development, stacked up in the back of my mind, but I've actually, about, ironically, 8 years ago, completed one. I've rambled about it before on the show. I digress. This would fit right in, and it, I think, is one of those questions that is always worthy of contemplation, because it pushes us beyond our comfort zone and challenges us to really question things like the paradigms that control our decision making, which most people don't want to engage in that sort of thinking every day. It's exhausting, and I respect that. I'm not, saying that, I'm not saying otherwise, but we should at all times remember that these kinds of questions have value and should not be neglected in favor of convenient and comfortable routines. Who is worthy? What is worthiness? How does one, generically speaking, and broadly speaking, how does one determine whether or not this person or that person is worthy? Does everyone deserve better? Or does no one really deserve anything? We have a lot of opinions about entitlement. Ooh, ouch, right? Trigger word. I'm not accusing anyone of entitlement, but I am asking the question, is there anyone that lacks it? I mean, surely the most destitute and the most poor are the most humble, but arguably, and I'm not trying to accuse any individuals of anything, right? I'm just speaking in the broadest terms. Arguably, even amongst the poorest of the poor and the most humble of the humble, there must be those who are either or, and something in between, the natural organic extremes of human behavior that we see repeated everywhere else. There must be those who are poor and humble and corrupt, driven by ego, hijacked from within, and those who are poor and humble and genuinely free of that kind of corruption in the broadest sense, right? And all of us exist somewhere in that spectrum, I would suggest. I don't think that any of us can claim to stand outside of that. And I agree, I'm perhaps easily called out as being hypocritical here because I am constructing an idea. I'm constructing a model, a paradigm by which to measure and discern the world, which can quickly become judgment, right? And that's what I theoretically stand against. But we must understand the tools we've built the prison of our minds with if we are ever to disassemble the prisons in our minds in order to free our minds. So I digress. Language is riddled with traps, so it becomes incredibly difficult to discuss really deep, profound, meaningful things because the traps get in the way. The traps entangle different people in different ways, and conversation gets sidetracked and derailed in as many ways imaginable or possible. We can, of course, easily imagine a paradox, a dichotomy that seems to define itself, right? A mutually arising dichotomy. I talk about them in the show often. Everyone deserves better, or no one deserves anything. Now, I always like to remind folks that when you stumble into a dichotomy, a pair of opposites, one must first question, are they mutually arising or mutually exclusive? Like, do they deny each other, or do they invoke one another? Or do they have some relationship in tandem? That's the word I was looking for the other day, yesterday, or the day before. I couldn't think of it while making a recording. Make a note for future self. When reviewing and rebooting this episode, make sure to go visit that other episode to find that moment and fill that word in correctly. And or maybe quote this bit over there for a hot second, just to be all meta self-referential. Okay, end note to self. How do we resolve this conundrum? Does everyone deserve better, or does no one deserve anything? Is there a middle ground? I usually posit that there is a middle ground, that there is a third alternative, that there is a, as Buddha called it, a middle path or a middle way. But this is one of the questions that hangs me up a little bit, because I don't see a very good middle path or a very Zen-like middle way. What I see in the middle way is sort of, it's as if this pattern is its inverse to how I normally perceive the proposition that between two polemics, the middle path is often the Zen option, right? That's a working postulate extrapolated from reading Zen and Buddhist and Hindu literature. You get to a place where you go, okay, they're all working with the same kind of cosmological models, ideas about how the universe might work. And inherent in their models is this idea that our mental models get in the way. Thus, this constant reference from all sources about clarification, either purifying oneself, the mind, the body, the soul, etc., or clarifying one's behavior, rectifying one's thinking. It's expressed in a bunch of different ways. And as I just went off on a tangent not too long ago, clarity is not some abstract notion, but a tangible phenomena. Tap into that episode for more, right? It's like a few episodes down on the list. I can't remember if it's called What is Meant by Clarity or something more of a... Either way, the word clarity is the key word. I'll go back and clean all these episodes up. So, digressing back to this question here. I'd love to hear from all 11 of you listening to the show what you think a third path would be here between these two options, everyone or no one. And you can, if it helps you to wrap your brain around it, you can think of it in terms of any of the, standard or classical or neoclassical examples of moral deterministic question. Like, if you found yourself in such and such situation, you have to choose between this or that. Which is the moral choice? Which is the best choice in moral terms? Excuse me. So in this case, here in this moment, I'm pondering. Let's not get distracted by what does deserve better mean right now, right? Let's set that aside. We'll come back to that in a hot second. But we have a choice. Everyone deserves better, deserves salvation, deserves redemption, deserves to be the chosen one. Everyone deserves, insert your favorite reward here, or no one deserves anything. Block out and preempt everything that could be reward or punishment. Is there a third path? Or is this a dichotomy that is so categorically true unto itself that each of the ends of the polemic, each of the opposites that are defining each other, seem to behave in what can only be described in approaching absolutist terms? Ding. I don't have a bell handy. I need a different bell because that one's way too loud for when I'm recording the podcast. But I need one of those cute, like, hotel lobby bells, a little dinky one that doesn't make too loud or pingy of a noise, so I can have a cute little bing, or a sound effect. Maybe I should just get a sound effect. I digress. Put a pin in that, Zeppo. Get a sound effect. It'll be easier, and I'll less likely to be, like, ear damaging to the audience. Ding. Okay, so why did I ring the bell? I have of late been, I think, a little redundantly or a little repetitively, and forgive me for that, folks, I've been interested in addressing this notion of absolutism because I see it being expressed. I see the creeping, slippery slope, creeping in kind of growth that is indicative of a slippery slope struggle on the absolutist thinking slope of ego trap, of absolutism. I personally strive and hope to aspire to, sometimes probably pretend erroneously, but hope that I can one day truly correctly state that I am not being absolutist in my thinking or in my rationale or in my presentation of the narratives I'd like to share, except for in my fiction where it might be useful to be an absolutist character or to present an absolute option that prevents all else. But that's another dimension, right? Like, fiction is fiction. And although this show that you're listening to is couched inside of fiction, that's a real literary term. Couched, I didn't just make that up. It does sound like you mean sitting in a couch, but I guess one way of thinking of it, in that this idea is sitting on a couch, in a couch. What is the correct? How do you walking beat sax here on this rock ball talk about it, or correctly conjugate that? And I say those terms with love, not with judgment or negative emotional attachment. I love all talking watery meat sacks of every shape and form in an absolute sort of universal cosmic way. And here is where that wasn't a random tangent, right? I don't think I'm being absolutist, and I'd like to remember, I always try to remember, that only the Sith, the bad guys, right? It's a lovely symbol borrowed from movie language, and I know the movie system's corrupt and they're all evil and we have to blah, 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 blah. Yet to be actually proven. Very strong theory, but some of the worst of it is, I think, fear-mongering of the absurdist, brainwashy type to just get everyone to hate everyone, right? Of course, corruption abounds throughout our society, but let's not get caught up in arguing about that. Only the Sith deal in absolutes. Only truly malevolent, nefarious bad guys, to take that right out of the movie context and fuck movies, right? I think in reality, it is accurate to say, although this, by using the word only, it becomes an absolutist type statement and becomes sort of hypocritical. The absurdist in me is one of the few isms, or ists, that I enjoy, absurdism, because absurdism is precisely a calling out of all ism, right? It's saying all constructs are stupid and silly and absurd, and some of them are useful, but look at how silly and absurd they are. Okay, only the Sith, the bad guys, those who are peddling nefarious, horrible, toxic, against your better good, not good for you, why would you choose that, types of agendas, actions, behaviors, products, ideas, emotions, religions, etc., those people deal in absolutes. Of course, that statement is very much like this statement is a lie, quote unquote. I'm not calling my statement a lie. I was quoting that conundrum statement. This sentence is a lie, right? It kind of betrays itself because by saying only the Sith deal in absolutes, then that statement really does become quite Sithy or quite evilish or quite nefarious looking because it is declaring itself absolutely, perhaps. My response to that is that I am being, quote, categorical. And I think I'm extrapolating here. I don't know that I've got an overwhelming consensus amongst linguists that categorical as a word, as a term, as a verb, is originally, in its original inception, meant to be used, or was used the way I might be using it. But I'm proposing, as all languages really are, despite whatever they might call themselves, common use languages. You know what I mean? Like, no matter what rules anybody might be trying to enforce, the words mean what they mean because that's how people use them in waves of evolutionary trending change. For better or worse, judge it, discern it, make up your own mind, but that's what happens, right? Okay, so categorical, what do I mean? I mean something that might resemble an absolutist sounding statement, but is in effect, because of its boundaries, actually radically different. Or one might say, here to be self-referential and funny, categorically different. And I think that helps, actually. A category here, I'm going to read from this note here that I wrote to myself. I've been sort of washing over the opening statement, but here's the bit where I got real serious when I went off on this note. A category of things can be self-consistent throughout and render a kind of relative, perceived or perceivably absolute state or absolute-like state. But by its very nature of being bound by the relativistic boundaries of its class and category, it fails to actually reach the true state of absolutist absoluteness, and thus cannot be used correctly or appropriately as a symbol of nor an expression of a symbol for nor an expression of absolutist thinking or absolutist ideology or absolutism. I humbly propose that in reality there is no real thing that is what absolutism, the idea, represents. There is no such thing as absolutism or absolute states of being in nature. There cannot be such a state of being because of the very functioning of reality as it is. Because all of reality, all of what we call the universe, is relativistic at its very core, in its very construction from the ground up. Nothing can truly be absolute. It can perhaps begin to appear like an absolute thing, state, idea, but it cannot truly be absolute. From the smallest of the small to the grandest of the impossibly huge, from the simplest level to the most complex level of reality, it is all an intra-connected, relativistically intra-related system of overlapping and intertwined systems of systems of systems made up of smaller systems that break down into smaller and smaller subsystems of subsystems, etc., etc., ad nauseam infinitum. Literally. Because, and I'm extending here, this is not written down, and I'll have to catch it for myself and capture this and write it down, type it out. Because the observable reality that we call the universe is measurably and verifiably fractal in nature, and everything that we experience here is indeed a result of a very complex, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, inner-outer spectrum of unfolding and infolding and outfolding and recursion of this fractalism or this fractal phenomena or this fractal process. That's the most accurate, I think, or of what I just spewed out. That gets closest to an accurate place. The universe is not a static collection of objects that are called places, right? It is not a place. It is an ongoing, infinite, and infinitely recursive. It is an infinite and infinitely self-recursive and infinitely ongoing process of processes, procedures of procedures within procedures, systems of systems that interact with other systems. And as such, none of it can be extracted from any of it else. Like, wow, that was a horribly constructed sentence. Pause. Are y'all following me, or am I like way deep off on the deep end here? A thing can look absolute, right? The sun appeared to be absolute to us for many generations. And then we realized, ultimately, once we measured it a little bit more closely and paid attention to its behavior a little bit more scientifically, we realized that, no, it's huge. It will last a very, very long time relative to the scale of our lifetimes. So in our lifetime, it appears to be this unstoppable, immutable, endless thing, but it's not. It is in and of itself not absolute. It is a very complicated, the sun I'm talking about, is a very complicated, interconnected, intertwined set of procedures that renders light and massive gravity, etc., etc., etc. All the things that science can measure, it's happening. It is happening them. It is emanating them. It is causing them. It is expressing them. It is, like us, as I've argued in a previous episode, all things are transducively, simultaneously projecting and consuming some level or a collection of actions or a system of images or this whole thing that we call the universe. Light is most certainly and undeniably emanating or being broadcast out from that which we call the sun and or other stars. And I argue that physically, quantum mechanically, and quantum spiritually, that is all interconnected systems of yins and yangs, of polemic, self-mutually arising, self-mutually invoking dichotomies. Not oxymorons, right? Not things that cancel themselves out. Although those do exist too, because you got to have balance. So all these systems of systems exist in various scales. And those scales, scales of, there can be scales of physical size. There can be a scale measuring temporal size. For lack of a better term, time doesn't exist the way we define it, but there is something that, for lack of another word, we can, could, should, would call time. And that it itself is not the passage of time as we use those words, but it is why we have this uncanny need and drive to make up those words, if that makes sense. Then you're getting closer and closer to attuning yourself to actually perceiving and understanding reality through you as your own scientific instrument, and not relying on other people's words, not my own, not anybody else's. That's the trick, right? The most insightful of scientists, where did they get their ideas from? If you go back and read books, memoirs and blah, 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 you'll see that there's a trend of trying to identify the source of inspiration, and that given background and personality and cultural anchors and religious setting, each might have, any individual scientist, any individual artist, any individual creator in the world, in the normal sense of the term, might have chosen a different attribute or a different facet of the world or a different name or a different way to call it. But ultimately, when you dig past the differences and you look for the congruence, the similarity, that which folds back and points to something that must be the same something, all those who openly discuss their process by which they receive that which we call inspiration ultimately point to some intangible source that resides simultaneously deep within and sort of also ubiquitously throughout the whole universe. They might have described it differently than I just did, but if you, like I said, burn past those things that seem to separate it and define it as different, and focus on those things that in fact function in the same way, you'll find that there's actually a larger consensus than there might appear at the surface or at first glance. But I digress. So, how does that help us understand this original question? Well, I'm still personally enjoying being stuck on this issue of I am questioning about my usual preference to find that middle path that splits the difference, because therein usually lies some balance, some equanimity, some opportunity for catharsis, right? Embedded in pursuing that middle way, as opposed to trying to split things apart in a false dichotomous choice that are two things that mutually exclude one another. When two things mutually exclude one another and people pick sides, you render conflict that is self-destructive for both sides. Put a pin in that. I'm going to wrap this episode up right there because I'm dedicated to making them snappier, shorter, and less monotonously droning on of me just rambling like crazy. But also, thanks for downloading and hopefully, really kind of drudging through the much longer episodes. They are the length they are because that's how much stuff needed to come out of my brain at the time. I am happy to confirm that I'm actually literally now, finally, in real terms, in position to engage in doing all those fancy things, those fanciful, pipe dreamy plans of rebooting and sort of remixing and re-exploring all previous episodes, trying to, get all those ums and ahs and ers and dead ends of like, oh, I totally lost my train of thought there. That's a great outtake, but doesn't need to be part of this episode. Kind of things that I coulda, shoulda, woulda done as a pre-production, pre-posting, pre-publication editing process. If this were a book, this were a novel, or a magazine, let's say, all of that would happen before the magazine hit the shelves or the virtual online distribution platforms. But I said, fuck it. I'm going to take that radical advice of starting where you are with what you've got and however you can do it as hard and as blunt and as to the limit as I can. So forgive me for all the really serious, dedicated listeners. You've been putting up with inadequate, rough draft versions, both in my own personal ability to speak and present the ideas that I'm trying to present, and also production value and the vision of what the podcast coulda, shoulda, woulda been, and versus what it actually is at this date and time. So brace yourselves. While there's a guiding vision, I don't know exactly how things are going to turn out, and I'm not entirely sure how long it's going to take or what rhythms are going to manifest. So I may not be dropping any of these new, revised, updated episodes right away. It might take a day or three, or a week or two or three for that to really get going. Depends on how things go today and tomorrow and the next day, and what, universal contexts and or life events may or may not get in the way. But theoretically speaking, I am free and clear between now and the end of summer to just focus on this at like 80% most days. I might have to take a few days off from focusing on this and other creative projects because the creative muscles need to rest, just like all other muscles need to rest when you're working them. But I've been sort of easing into and warming up to this whole thing, and I've got a rhythm and a thing and a setup and a feng shui, and I'm finally, whereas before I was still lacking elements of the bigger picture. Never mind, I haven't gotten co-hosts or contributors. That's stage 5. That's for God knows, I don't know how many more months or years away. But I now have my quote studio, like let's say at a version 2.8 as opposed to a version 0.9, which is 0.01 when you start. So things are improving, and I'm really, honestly, genuinely happy and grateful for whoever you are out there that keeps playing and listening to and downloading these episodes on Sprecher and on the other platforms, wherever you might get this show. Thanks for tuning in. If you appreciate what I'm doing, give me some feedback. Ask me the questions that you haven't heard me address. And if you hate what I'm doing, and you can put it in thoughtful, intelligent, collaborative, progressive, creative development, critical analysis kind of critique, bring it. And all haters, you're all welcome to hate, because hate brings eyeballs too. But just understand that I'm cannot respond to the hate the way a hater wants, somebody to react. I don't do that. I don't play the hater games. So brace yourselves for that. I know a wave of new audience haters and trolls and supporters is coming, because curiously, all my social media numbers have been slowly and surreptitiously creeping up just now as I'm preparing to really focus on elevating my routine here and my presentation overall, And the backlog of content and the future log of content, it's all taken a step up, hopefully. Knock on wood. Hopefully, I'm not making empty promises, but I'm actually stepping up my game in real, measurable terms. And hopefully, you, dear listeners, who have put up with all this nonsense in the roughest and most horrible form that it has presented itself so far, you will be rewarded for your loyalty by getting to revisit and re-enjoy previous conversations I've had with myself that I've encouraged you to listen to in a new and interesting way that is worth re-exploring. If I totally fail at achieving that, you are more than welcome to call it out and let me know that I'm not living up to it. Thanks. Thank you for being who you are. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling other people you think might appreciate this show about this show. And thanks for tuning in. Until next time, I have been your eccentric and humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappo.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.